Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Support life with every call and text when you switch your cell phone service. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special Christmas offer now through February 2nd.
Got some news from the Pope that is a mixed bag. We'll start with the good, and then we'll get to the mixed, and then we'll get to the bad. So we'll start off on the right foot and do so immediately. We go to, we'll start here, actually. He issued a statement to the bishops the last couple of days, especially the ones in the United States, telling them essentially that there's nothing really charitable with how easy they have been giving out annulments. This is not an attack on anybody who received such an annulment in who's watching this now. But as a broad practice, the church has been very permissive on this in the last several decades. The opposite end of the spectrum of this was before Vatican II, when it was nearly impossible to get one. And now they're a formality. For the most part, obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, people who sought them either for what were in their mind legitimate reasons and were turned down. But the acceptance rate of them is like in the upper 90th percentile chance that you're going to get one if you ask for one. And the Pope told them, look, you're going a little far with this. There's nothing merciful and there's nothing charitable about what you're doing here. And it needed to be said. So good on him for that. Now, one statement that people took to be a good one, and I think it's on the mixed bag side of things because he's making a giant omission here. Being aware, you've got to be aware of the things that have been happening in Nigeria the last several years, really. The Pope called for an end to the violence and at the asking for people who were taken, for Christians who've been taken by our Ottoman adversaries, to release them. Except he never named the group doing this. He never named the religion behind it. Go figure, that would destroy ecumenical dialogue. So the headline from Arise.tv, Pope Leo appeals for the release of taken school children in Nigeria. He appeals for Nigerian school children and priests to be released as group calls on the UN, the ICC to probe the large-scale ending of Christians in that country. And it's a good thing that he's doing this. People have been wondering, why he's so silent on Nigeria? Nigeria is kind of a big deal right now. It's not the only place in Africa where this stuff is happening, but it's just the latest hotbed. What ended up happening in several days ago that a group of violent types entered a Christian school and taken now the estimate is 315 students, teachers, and priests from there. On Sunday, the organization stated that 50 of the students had actually managed to escape. So that's a good thing. Let's hope nothing bad was done in retaliation to those they still had. At Sunday prayers, this is from the article, Leo XIV called for the immediate release of students and priests who were taken in recent days in Nigeria and Cameroon. Also, 6 Catholic priests were taken from the Archdiocese of Bamenda in Cameroon, and a Baptist pastor was taken in the same region. Speaking in St. Peter's Square, the Pope said he had, quote, learned with immense sadness the news of the takings of priests, faithful, and students. I feel deep sorrow, especially for many of the boys and girls and their anguished families. And he calls on the competent authorities to do something about this. All that's fine. But he is unwilling to recognize what the source of this is. It's a certain crescent moon religion with their followers worshiping a false prophet who the only positive thing you can say about them is that they are on fire for their beliefs. They really are. Unfortunately for us. Fortunately for the Christians in that country. He won't name them. And I can't because of our host's rules, but nothing stops him from doing so. Why doesn't he? It's because ecumenia rules the day. They preach a universalist salvation in the Vatican these days. And as we get to our main story here, there was this report, I covered this initially, the initial part of the story last week or the week before, where a priest who had attempted to, and I think even had relations with a teenage girl, had been in Peru. The Pope, when he was the cardinal archbishop there, had had been accused of not taking this seriously. Well, let's go to the first update on this, because this stuff suddenly started snowballing. So we're going into Info Vaticana, the only people who seem to have the guts to cover this story, at least in the print media. Headline: Lute, the McCarrick-type priest from Chiclayo, the diocese the Pope was the bishop of, asks the Pope to grant him the grace of dispensation to prevent the investigation and trial. He's asking for special favors to be spared an investigation and a trial for what he did. That takes guts. The controversial case involving Leo XIV risks being closed prematurely without truth or redress for the victims. Under the pretext of carrying out missionary activities, Lute persuaded the girls and their parents to accept overnight trips and stays in the mountains, where he then went and did things he should not do. Although, I covered this before, the article made it clear that he didn't go the distance, we'll say, if you understand my meaning. He did grotesquely inappropriate things that he should receive the ultimate penalty for, and publicly so. Let's not mince words here. Just got to be careful with how people getting scandalized and by our hosts' bizarre rules about these things. And that doesn't excuse what he did, but it might be comforting for some people, I suppose. The controversy surrounding this was initially attempted to be dismissed by church officials as being in part of an ultra-conservative conspiracy to undermine the Pope and undermine the bishop. Well, here's what ended up happening from the article. While the victims continue to await justice, the process has taken an unexpected and alarming turn. According to what Friar Giampiero Gambaro told the complainants in a meeting held 2 days after the passing of Pope Francis, Lute, that's the nickname of the priest, has formally requested Rome to grant him dispensation from the clerical state, a kind of voluntary resignation that, if approved by Rome, would immediately end the ecclesiastical legal proceedings against Lute. Gambaro assured the victims that, given the context of the sede vacante, that would be the interregnum between Francis and Leo, their request would be accepted by the new pope within months, almost inevitably. In other words, there would be no investigation, no verdict, no accountability, just a case closed in silence. This is a man who had, we'll say, harmed in the most intimate way possible, pretty much anyway, or come right up to the line of it, young girls. Well, it's should be no shock then that this Info Vaticana now has a follow-up story. And for some reason, the Pope granted him his wish. Headline from Info Vaticana: Leo XIV grants Lute a dispensation and leaves the victims of Chiclayo without investigation or trial. That man has been reduced from the clerical state to the lay state. Fine, that should actually happen immediately, but the problem with it is, of course, now there will be no investigation or trial. We're expected to just let this simply go. By the way, this is the kind of stuff that Bishop, then Archbishop, and then Cardinal, and then now Pope Robert Prevost had been accused of doing as bishop. And when certain voices, Chris Jackson at Heraeth in Exile on Substack, Stephen Cox on Substack, a few others tried to warn people, tried to say, hey, this was the real deal. Everybody was like, give him a chance. Well, turns out this is exactly what happened. A harsh and incomprehensible turn in the Lute case. According to local media in Chiclayo, the victims of priest Eleuterio Vasquez, known as Lute, were summoned in person without prior notification to their lawyer because Gambaro had received orders to personally deliver a very important communication to them. They had expected to be a letter from the Pope with an apology and a way to resolve their situation turned into a scene unbecoming of the seriousness of a canonical process. An anonymous church messenger handed them a dirty folded sheet of paper without an envelope, official seal, or file number in full view of everyone. This piece of paper, written informally, the level of formality unbecoming of the gravity of the sea, announced that the Pope had granted their person who harmed them the grace of dispensation from the clerical state. The blow to the victims is devastating. Last September, they expressly requested that for the sake of justice, no dispensation be granted until a proper investigation was carried out and a sentence handed down. However, the Pope ignored this request. The dispensation was issued the same month and announced just a few days ago, confirming that he never rectified the situation despite the pleas of those who reported the harm. And they've been asking for justice for years. For years. And he sided essentially with the man who did the harm. Meet the new boss, same as the old. Everyone with the $10 super chat, I do appreciate it. Thanksgiving week of blessings to all. Yes, it is Thanksgiving in the U.S. I will have a live stream Thursday morning, Thanksgiving morning. Don't worry, as usual, we'll cover the news as it happens. But it is Thanksgiving week in the United States. So in case you're wondering why some of your commentators are slowing down, why the news out of America might be slowing down, that's why. But it will be business as usual here. Now, it seems that Archbishop Vigano really had, I think he cracked. He couldn't take this anymore. And he posted to his official X account. And yes, I know for a fact this is his X account. Here's what he had to say. In Peru, those who survived the harm in Chiclayo have issued a devastating public statement. As children, they say they were harmed by Father Eleuterio Vasquez Gonzalez. They reported that after years of negligence, Leo has now granted him a dispensation from the clerical state without any serious canonical investigation or trial. The victims say the preliminary inquiry was a joke, that they were manipulated into seeing the dispensation as a victory, and that reality it shuts down their case forever. Without a canonical judgment, they remain publicly vulnerable to those who call them liars, while the priest is quietly removed from the clerical role and spared any formal condemnation. This touches Leo's own record in Chiclayo, where his handling of these kinds of allegations has already raised severe questions. The rhetoric of zero tolerance dissolves into a paper maneuver that removes a problem priest while leaving the victims without justice. Where's the lie? Where's the lie? This is just exactly the kind of thing that happened under Francis, and frankly, before those who came before Francis, in the post-Vatican II years. The Vatican has been remarkably bad at handling these kinds of cases, and it's gotten a lot of people wondering why. Well, we know for a fact, it's absolute fact, that the Jesuits and other lavender types were essentially the lifeblood of the Roman Curia in the post-Vatican II years. Benedict once lamented to a journalist who came to speak to him privately in a private audience, and saying, "Look, Holy Father, we mailed you lists and dossiers of these kinds of priests, and nothing happened to them. Why didn't you act?" And he said, "I never get my mail. People read my mail." Who do you think that is? Kinds of people who maneuvered to get Francis there, who probably maneuvered to get Benedict out. That's what's happening there. And sometimes these, we'll call them dissident laicized priests. These are men who reject the formal teachings of the church and make it obvious so in their own behavior. Sometimes they don't go away quietly, such as in this case here. From LifeSite News, we get this unfortunate headline. This dissident laicized priest wants the church to abandon the mandatory clerical celibacy. I see a lot of otherwise decent, good Catholics who think that mandatory celibacy is a bad idea. Well, the Bible makes it pretty clear. The teachings of the church, all the way back to the beginning, make it pretty clear that celibacy was the default state for priests. There had been a time when in the West we allowed for married priests, and it's a practice that persists in the East. But, I've actually met Eastern priests who think it's a terrible idea for us to get rid of clerical celibacy. And usually the biggest defenders of clerical celibacy are, in fact, young priests. These are the men who you would think have the most interest in the removal of mandatory celibacy. Well, this priest thinks it's a terrible idea. He's not exactly a moral figure that we should be emulating. From the article, quote, "An interview with a laicized priest has reignited the debate over married clergy. On November 16th, Italian newspaper Il Gazzettino published an interview with Luca Favarin, a priest barred from exercising his ministry, who was then dismissed from the clerical state and released from his obligation to celibacy. I have decided not to hide. I have turned my life upside down according to my desires and my needs," Favarin, 53, told his interviewer. "I fell in love, and I am with a woman I care very much about. It is early, but I would also like to have a child." Favarin is a man with an interesting CV. He is a former parish priest with missionary experience in Africa and pastoral experience with prisoners, a sommelier, an expert in fine French wines, a consultant in intercultural pedagogy, a former university lecturer, and the author of books against racism. So the word YouTube doesn't like you using too much for some reason. 3 years ago, the Diocese of Padua suspended Favorina from celebrating the sacraments and from preaching because of conflicts with his ordinary, Bishop Claudio Cipolla. These apparently concerned his, quote, method of entrepreneurial activities. In fact, Favorin was managing as many as 9 reception centers for immigrants. For you Americans watching, you may not know this, but that situation in Europe is a lot worse than it is in America, with people's private property being seized de facto or through contracts. Private property to then put at service at the new arrivals. Hotels often are the biggest examples of this. I've heard of homeless shelters and other things that you would think would be much more useful being used to serve the people who actually are supposed to be there. And then they're turned into these reception centers. And this priest managed 9 of them himself, which is amazing. To this activity, he added a civic engagement that was difficult to reconcile with Catholic doctrine. He supported so-called James Martin type rights and doctors helping people to be removed from this mortal coil. After his suspension from ministry, he obtained from Pope Francis in 2023 a papal dispensation that returned him to the lay state and released him from the obligation of celibacy. His laicization was considered worthy of public attention. Now the priest has returned to the media spotlight to assert his choice to have a romantic relationship with a woman, her identity currently unknown to the public, and his simultaneous desire to resume ministry within the Catholic Church as a fully reinstated priest. Reappearing in multiple news outlets this week, the Favorin case has reopened the debate on clerical celibacy. At the same time, the idea is taking hold in Italian media that a Catholic priest can support positions contrary to the gospel, such as supporting James Martin's parody of holy matrimony and, of course, the removal of adults from this mortal coil. And it goes on. This is one of those examples that if I were associated with the movement for ending mandatory clerical celibacy, I would want that priest as far away from us as possible, because a guy like that is going to bring a lot of negative attention. He's clearly very confused. He is being pulled in 2 directions. If he had fully repented and said, I have spent the last 2 years living with monks, doing nothing but praying and fasting and working on my vices and everything else, and I would like to be reinstated to the clerical state, I will be happy to work in prison ministry for the rest of my life if need be. I would actually consider, that it might be a good idea. But no, that's not what he's asking for. He's essentially asking for the church to admit it was wrong, to dismiss him. Amazing stuff. Be careful who your allies are. And we have more on the front of bishops and priests resigning. This is amazing. This one comes from Info Vaticana as well. Under the headline, Leo XIV accepts the resignation of the Bishop of Cadiz and Ceuta, Rafael Zornoza. This is coming at a time when there's a lot of weird news coming out of the Spanish-speaking world. It's Spain and South America. Religious orders shut down. Some of them fairly conservative, but kind of weird at the same time. And then you've got, this, and this is another McCarrick kind of bishop. A lot of these guys are just quietly resigning, because what happens? If they resign, and if the Pope grants them the dispensation from the clerical state, guess what happens? The investigation goes away. And the secular authorities typically, in most places, will allow the Catholic Church to handle the problems themselves. In this day and age, with these kind of responses from the Vatican, maybe that's not the best approach to this. Maybe in some cases, not by governments who are overtly hostile to the faith. I would say Spain would probably be the exception here. The Spanish are busy erasing their own Catholic history. The government is anyway. They're basically the same kinds of people who were in charge of Spain during the Fatima apparitions, if you're familiar with that whole sordid history. But in other places, it could very well be that the best way approach would be, regardless of what the church does, what the bishops do, what Rome does, that would be good for the investigations to continue. I'm thinking of places like the United States. Here are the details. The Holy See has confirmed that Pope Leo XIV has accepted the resignation of Rafael Zornoza Boy from the pastoral governance of the Diocese of Cadiz and Ceuta. The official announcement appears in the Holy See Bulletin. The decision comes after days of speculation about his departure. Zornoza submitted his resignation upon reaching the age of 75, as stipulated by Canon 401 subsection 1, and had been serving under an extended term. His departure comes amid a canonical investigation by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith against the prelate for alleged Carrick-type offenses against a minor while he was performing training duties in the seminary Getafe, Madrid in the 90s. The Holy See has appointed Bishop Ramon Dario Valdivia Jimenez, auxiliary bishop of Seville, as apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Cadiz and Ceuta. The announcement was confirmed by the Diocese of Seville through its official X account, where it reported the commission received by Valdivia, while the Cadiz see remains vacant. And so some will say, well, he hit 75, so they just accepted his resignation. Maybe. But that becomes obviously and very clearly very convenient timing for that resignation to be accepted. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but the Pope Leo has a habit of, at first, he was very restrained in his response in his relationships with the media and public statements he was giving. Now he's giving a lot of public addresses, a lot of them electronically. He recently gave some addresses to some American college students via Zoom. He gives a lot of off-the-cuff interviews now with the media, which are, like under Francis, the source of many of the scandals now coming out about him, because he says things that go against the reputation he has. You'll remember, on the day he was named Pope, we were told he has a reputation of being very measured, keeping the media at a distance, being thoughtful, and choosing his words very carefully. That turned out not to be the case. Now he's better than Francis on that. That's also a very low bar. You're not going to have Pope Leo practically explicitly rejecting church teachings on things at least to the degree Francis did. But the Pope, this new Pope, is keeping up with many of the, we'll call it a synodal and ecumenical electronic outreach programs that his predecessor had. I'm going to show you one that is causing a stir. This is posted to the Independence account on YouTube. Pope Leo and priest Guilherme surprise worshippers with electronic rave party. Yes, the Pope is giving an address at a rave. Here we go.
With joy, I greet you as you gather before the splendid Cathedral of Kosice, which is a beating heart of faith and hope. Coming from different nations, yet united by the same faith, your presence is a tangible sign of the fraternity and peace that is instilled in our hearts by friendship with Christ. I impart to you my apostolic blessing and entrust each of you to the protection of the Virgin Mary, Mother of the Church and Queen of Peace. And may the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come upon you and remain with you always. Amen.
Muting this now so that we can avoid any copyright issues. But they're playing electronic music, throwing a few, digital crosses on it as if that's going to make it okay. And there's the DJ. The DJ's a priest. Why? Who thought this was a good idea? Who in their right mind thought that was a good idea? There is a very much hello fellow kids thing going on here. It seems like, let's reach people where they are. So let's have the Pope address a rave. Wonderful idea. Hey, let's have this rave in front of a cathedral. Even better idea. We did not need to ever open the windows of the church to the world to let some fresh air in. The fresh air being the ideas of the world that seem on paper a good idea, to blow away some of that old rigidity and staleness in the church, basically, is what John the 23rd said. We never needed to do that. And since then, it's just been one thing after another, getting worse and worse as time goes on. That's how you got the Assisi conferences in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. So you got the Pachamama debacle in 2019. It's had how you've gotten, these World Youth Days that, sometimes have really good things happen. large numbers of young people receiving the Eucharist and going to Mass. It's a good thing. The scandalous things that happen there, like clockwork, are not so good. And on paper, maybe they should rethink the whole thing. But they're very secular, like ways of trying to take something secular and use it for the church. And that doesn't always work. And so now we have, a dance party hosted by the Vatican, of all things. And you almost wonder, how far are they willing to go with this? If you've ever been in your misbegotten youth to a nightclub, you know that the culture there is not something the church ever wants to even come close to emulating. It's not just the music. The music's the least of the problems. There's other things that happen at these places that these environments foster. And maybe that's just not appropriate for church outreach. It's a novel thought, but maybe a more conservative approach is better. Some uncomfortable questions being asked in the live chat. Is the Pope using controlled stuff? No, I'm going to assume that he's not. I just think that it's that this is the result of the Vatican Dicastery for Communications. Someone there giving him the idea that this is a good idea, a good way to reach out to the kids, to the youth, to the future of the church. And I don't know. I don't think this is a good idea. Well, I'll never chastise anybody for, the kind of music they like. I don't think any genre of music is bad. There are plenty of bad artists in every single genre of music, either bad because they make just objectively bad music, like they're just objectively not making what would be called good by that genre's standards, or they are making bad music as in morally bad. And a lot of overlap between the two, as it turns out. Just got to use some discernment, right? And part of that discernment is knowing when and where. Let's say you're a fan of, I don't know, the 70s rock band Rush. Most Catholics who like that would not think it's a good idea to play that at Mass. 99% of them. There's that 1% to be like, hey, let's get some 2112 played here during the Mass. That's a bad idea. Don't do it. This is the same thing here. The Pope addressing a rave. Come on. Whoever told him that this was a good idea, needs to actually maybe have a sit-down conversation with their spiritual director, assuming they have one. I would assume if you are in a position to plan events for the Pope, and you do so on behalf of, in a position in the Vatican, that you are getting some kind of spiritual advisement, right? You'd assume as such. You'd think come with it'd be a perk of the job. Whereas the rest of us have a hard time finding a decent spiritual director. You'd think that a priest or a layperson in these jobs wouldn't have a hard time. As Lily says, Pope Leo needs our prayers. It's unfortunate every time there's just a new scandal. This should be the last thing the Pope is promoting. You would think so. In fact, you would think that he would instead, as Philip says, be promoting one of the numerous traditional pilgrimages, or just a pilgrimage in general that just looks Catholic. We don't need to get to the traditional and everybody else divide. Just obviously Catholic, right? That's all we'd ask. Love the synodal take harmony. Yeah, that's what this is. This is all about synodality, and it is, as another person says, just another sign of the times. So let me know what you think of this in the comments. Please pray for Pope Leo. I'm not trying to trash him here. Pray for him. He needs your prayers anyway. If you think he's doing the best job ever and that we're just full of nonsense critiquing this stuff, pray for him anyway. You should be praying for him. If you think he is like the forerunner to the Antichrist, pray for him. And if you're like 99% of people watching this, you're somewhere in between, pray for him. There's not really an excuse not to. Otherwise, let me know what you think of this in the comments. Please hit like and subscribe. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot too. And, if you've ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition, options in the description box below. That does help a lot as well. Again, pray for the church that she emerged from this weird trial she's in. Because the church needs your prayers. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.